All right, everyone. Welcome to Socratic Discourse. This is where we say we follow the argument wherever it leads. So today I have my friend here, Amos Nato. We were here last time talking about who was that? Christopher Hitchens.
Yes.
Yeah, we are here talking about Christopher Hitchens, and we are back together again to talk about another atheist. So welcome, Mr. Nato. Will you please say hi and tell us how you've been and where you have been for those days, for all those days?
Thank you. As you said, my name is Amos Nato. Glad to be here. I've been busy preaching the gospel, especially among students. And
Yeah.
I'm here. I'm still reading, pursuing God, studying and knowing more about Him.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the stream again.
Thank you. I appreciate.
You see, you seem to have something with atheist. What is it?
I usually, one of the things I've endeavored to do is to, before I critique someone, I usually desire to know what he believes in. So I've endeavored to study them, to study their books and what they believe in before I critique them. So I believe that is the right process of actually engaging them. Is first, before I say anything about them, I need to know what they're actually saying.
Absolutely, and I also think that is something that also non-Christians should learn.
Yes.
That before you critique someone's argument, ensure you present that argument accurately.
Yes.
Because I don't know what your experience is, but my experience has been that many of the people who critique Christianity do so not necessarily because they understand it. Most of the times they're actually critiquing a straw man.
That's true. That's true. Both from other
Or we
religions
don't
like
do it.
Islam, like even atheists, most
Yeah,
of them have not actually read the Bible. The Christianity they know is from what they have seen or
absolutely.
heard people say, but not really knowing Christianity from its root, that is the Bible. So
Absolutely.
I second what you are saying.
Yeah. So great. I'm glad that you wrote a paper on Sam Harris. What interested you to write a paper on his moral landscape? Because that is what we'll be discussing today, critiquing Sam Harris's moral landscape. I think the subtitle is How Science Determines Morality, right?
Yes. What really
I also wrote, sorry?
what really motivated me to read and also write about summaries was I
Yeah.
wanted to know something about morality. I thought listening and reading atheist, discovered that if there was a weakness that they had, the argument against God was actually the argument of morality. It was like their weakest
Yeah.
point. So I wanted to know what summary says, especially from a scientific point of view. So that is what really motivated me to read that book and to read him. Yeah.
Um, great. Frank Turek has written a book called Stealing from God.
Yes.
This one here.
Yeah.
Why atheists need God to make their case? They steal moral standards from God as well in order to make their case.
That's true. And that is clearly seen in the book of Samaris, the moral landscape. That is what he does.
Absolutely. I also wrote a paper on him, by the way.
Okay.
I titled my paper the immoral landscape.
Okay. I desire to read it. No, I read it. I read it. I read it.
You read
Yes.
it, right?
Yes.
A critique of some Harris's moral landscapes, how science can determine human value. So, this is going to be a topic of discussion today in the few minutes that follow, because our brother Nato has also written a paper on it. This is philosophy of religion, right?
Yes.
I'm
No,
a,
no, no. Ethics.
ethics. Yeah, sure. Yeah, ethics. Right. Okay. So let's immediately get into this. Why Sam Harris? Why Sam Harris and not any other?
Sam Harris. I think I've read several atheists. I'd never read Sam
Yeah,
Harris. I'd only heard him debate other Christian philosophers and apologists. So I know there are 2 or 3 books I know. That is The End of Faith. And then there's a letter to the Christian nation. And then there is the moral landscape. So I was really interested to know what he's actually positing, because he presents a very interesting argument for
yeah.
morality from an atheistic point of view. So I really got interested to know how he approaches that topic. Yeah.
How science determines morality, right? Uh, I mean, to me, that seems very interesting. But of course, we are going to talk about scientific. we are going to talk about scientism, for example. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what we are going to talk about, because it seems to me that is what Sam Harris is doing.
Yes.
You can't. I don't know, but in my own assessment, I don't think you can actually use science as a foundation for morality.
You cannot. And that's what he tries to do.
Yeah,
Uh, Interestingly, as we're going to see, he says he's a scientist and he hates philosophers. You can actually see that from the language of the book. Yet he's a philosopher trying to smuggle in science to prove his point. But only he ends
yeah.
up treating us with bad philosophy, really. So that is what you're calling scientism, is actually using science to justify something else.
Yeah, so he already has a worldview, and science seems to be uh, a way that he uses to justify that. So now,
Yeah.
before we get to the critique, of Sam Harris, because I think one of the things you mentioned in your paper is that you acknowledge his belief in objective morality. So will you just make a comment about that?
Interestingly, for some reason, like probably other atheists, even unlike Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins, he tries to bring in something interesting. He believes in an objective morality, and that is quite interesting because most atheists are actually relativists. So he brings in that concept, and he believes that actually morals should be and ethics should be universal and objective. So that is a positive thing, thinking of it. It makes sense, and is actually stands strong against relativism. Is against it, and he sees the foolishness and the self-contradiction of relativism, which is a good thing. But now the only problem is the basis of that, his basis, and also
Mhm.
how he goes around it.
Okay, absolutely, and that is what we want to establish tonight.
Yes.
So, what is your main critique of Sam Harris's moral landscape? In your honor, what will be like your main critique of his book?
My main critique is actually how he smuggles in science. He says that science can and should explain morality and ethics, because he interchangeably uses the word morality and ethics, but he says science can explain that. So I'm coming to this book knowing that actually I'm going to be treated with science and to see how science solves that issue. But no, Samari smuggles in something called, he brings in a concept called well being. So he has a concept of well being that is unjustifiable. So he brings in science to justify that. So that is my main critique of this book, that it's actually a philosophical book. It's not a scientific book.
Yeah,
So he's a philosopher, not a scientist in that regard when you read that book. So that is my main critique of that book.
absolutely. I think I just want to read. Want to read a quote from him. I think he writes. I think on page 9 of his book. I think this is his main argument. He says that human well-being entirely depends on events in the world and on states of the human brain. Consequently, there must be scientific truths to be known about it. A more detailed understanding of these truths will force us to draw clear distinctions, different ways of living in society with one another, judging some to be better or worse, more or less true to the facts, and more or less ethical. Actually, Harry says that morality is the undeveloped
Branch of
branch of
science.
undeveloped branch of science. Okay,
Yeah.
now Why do you think that his argument that morality can be grounded in science is fallacious? Or why do you think it actually breaks down?
As That's a good question. He actually, when he's talking about science, he's talking about neuroscience because he's a
Yeah,
neuroscientist.
neuroscience, absolutely, yeah.
He's a neuroscientist. So he's saying neuroscience can explain, and secondarily, social conditions can explain morality. So where his science fails, there's actually somewhere where he says, and I just want to read it. He says that the concept of well-being, his concept, is just like health and is open for revision and discovery. That is what he says.
Yeah.
So that is what he says. So when you look at his science is not actually objective, because if you are talking about an objective basis for morality, which is universal, when you're talking about something that is universal, it should transcend not only culture, because that is what he believes and it's true. He says it transcends culture, but it should also transcend time. So the kind of science he's talking about can only transcend probably culture, but not time, because he says in his book it is actually subject to revision. So then, we're actually ending up in relativism, but not actually something objective. So then the next culture, the next generation will have parameters to define its own truth in a certain way. So their truth may not be our truth because it is subject to revision. So that kind of science, and that is actually, I think, the nature of science, because the nature of science is that it must leave a certain door open for revision and further experimentation. So, but if you're talking about morality, if we go that route, then this is not something universal and something objective, really. Because something that is prone to change cannot be objective, really. Because what is change? Change is alteration from one state to another. So
Absolutely.
that is a limitation of science as it brings it in the domain of morality and ethics.
So I think it will also, that will also imply that if what he talks about is subject to change, there's a sense in which the implication of that is morality is bound to change as well. So
It is,
probably
yeah.
what we consider to be good today will maybe sometimes, because he's an evolutionist, isn't it?
He is, yes.
He believes strongly that the revolution is actually true. But I think what
Yes.
you say is true, because you also quote C.S. Lewis, and and this is what you say. You say that Sam Harris's question actually begs the argument, and I think I agree with you, because I think that is also one of the point of disagreement I had with Sam Harris when I was reading his book, because he assumes he assumes that the well-being of conscious creatures is a good thing, right? Or what he says, that the well-being of sentient beings is a good thing. So that is what he assumes, that their well-being is good, and then he goes on and says, okay, science can tell you then what is good in as far as the well-being of sentient creatures is concerned. But I loved your quote of C.S. Lewis here, and I just want to read you. It says that if things can improve, that is the point you're making, that things are subject to change, as Harris argues. He says that if things can improve, this means that there must be some absolute standard of good above and outside the cosmic process towards that process can approximate. There is no sense in talking of becoming better if better simply means that we are becoming. It is like congratulating yourself on reaching your destination and defining destination as the place you have reached. And they actually say here that Harris has reached his destination and defined it as the place that he has actually reached.
Yes.
I
That's
I
true.
thought I thought that was very interesting here. But also,
Yeah.
just still on the issue of well-being, okay? Because it talks about the well-being of conscious creatures, right?
Yes.
So why do you think that is not a sufficient moral foundation? Why do you think the well-being of certain creatures is not a sufficient moral foundation?
Um, You see, that is the realm of philosophy.
Yeah.
We're talking about well-being because that is a concept he has, and he's
Yeah.
rallying people to believe that. And
Hmm.
then, now, as we said, he uses science to justify that. In fact, let me juxtapose this with what he says about Phil Collins. He is actually so negative against Collins, who has written a book about the language of God. He's a
Yeah.
scientist
I
who is a
noticed that as
Christian.
well. Mm.
Yeah. So he says Collins, what he does is that he's a scientist, yes, but he smuggles in the concept of God to justify his science. But actually, Sam Harris does the same thing by bringing in the concept of science to justify the concept of well-being. So the concept of well-being cannot be a sufficient basis for morality because, as you're going to see probably from the
Yeah.
little talk we have had, it is insufficient because it does not give it sufficient explanatory gist to it to explain
Hmm.
why it is a good foundation for morality and ethics. So
Hmm.
when you look at his explanation, or rather when you look at his treatise, it lacks that explanatory power. So it is not something you can rally people to because I didn't see any justification,
Yeah. Yeah.
or rather reasonable justification to believe in him. He seems to jump from one point to another. He seems to contradict himself, and probably shall talk about that here and there. So it is not something that is consistent. So it is something that actually draws you to relativism than to anything objective.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And he says that meaning, values, morality, and the good life must relate to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures, and in our case, must lawfully depend upon events in the world and upon the states of the brain. So, in other words, Harris believes that when we understand the human brain and how it relates to the factors in its environment, we can deduce what contributes to human well-being. I think you almost see how that one is circular, begging the question.
Yes.
So if I get if I get what you're saying from your paper, it's like Sam Harris is arguing that which is good is that which supports the well-being of conscious creatures,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
But as we pointed before, he already assumes that the well-being of conscious creatures is a good thing.
It's a good thing, yeah.
And you
How did
said in
he
your
know?
yes. So how did he know? And let me hear your comment here, because you say in your paper you say this, that why is the well-being of human beings better than that of insects? Right? Will you just want to make a comment on that as well?
Yeah, there are many things Harris assumes. In fact, even before we reach there are several assumptions or other things he should tell us, and which are very basic or foundational to morality.
Mhm.
He does not explain probably the genesis of good and evil. Why do we have good and evil? Probably why not just good alone? Why not evil
Yeah.
alone?
Mhm.
Where do we get this dichotomy? So that is the first thing that we need to hear from Sam Harris. And then now, secondly, going to your point of, so he assumes, as you rightly said, so he assumes that the well-being of conscious creatures is actually good, but he does not give us a good explanation why the well-being of conscious creatures, which is actually human beings, why that is good, and the well-being of conscious creatures of animals is not good. So, on what basis does he say the well-being of conscious creatures, human beings, is good, but not other things, probably animals? So he does not give that explanation. So when you look at actually Harry's position or worldview, it is actually descriptive by nature, but it cannot lead you to an ought. It cannot lead you
Yeah.
to something prescriptive. So
Yeah.
he's only describing what is happening. Uh, he's only describing what is happening because he does not have the power, rather the know-how, to explain the why as we experience it in reality.
Yeah.
So if you are actually coming here and giving us something different, please handle some of these basic questions we have.
Yeah.
And I don't see Harris answering those questions quite well.
Yeah.
He assumes.
He assumes things, and
Yes.
then he goes on to give arguments for he's already the conclusions he has already made.
The conclusion is already made. And it is either, when you read him, it is either the moral landscape or nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you mentioned in his paper, of course, we will talk about his own issue of determinism and others, because that is also one of the critiques you have about him in his paper. But one of the things you also talk about is the issue of the is-ought fallacy
Yes.
problem. Like you cannot derive an ought from an is. Why do you think that undermines Harris's position?
So there are two people. That was Gmo and David Hume, I think so. They're the ones
Mm,
who said that you cannot derive an ought from an is. That is, you cannot derive ethics from what is actually being done. Like what Geisler says, that sometimes
mm,
people are cruel and they kill each other, but that does not mean that we ought to kill each other. So
absolutely.
it's like what Harris does is that he says, you see, people kill each other. So then that means we ought to kill each other. I'm only trying to extend that analogy.
Yeah.
So that is his actually belief. So what he's doing is he's actually deriving an ought from an is. What is happening? And then he ends up now prescribing what should be done from that point. So most of the scientists, if you think of it, and even philosophers of in history, they have
Mm,
tended to separate the two. They've tended to separate the two. You can't jump. You can't jump that bandwagon. You can't jump.
yeah.
It's a divide. And that's why someone like Albert Einstein actually believed that religion and science should co-work together. They're two different
Mm,
disciplines. Mm.
yeah.
Because rather, when you look at religion, it is in the realm of morality. Morality is in the realm of religion. Ethics is in the realm of religion. Because now we're coming in now to prescribe what people ought to do. But you see, science is descriptive by nature. It's just like sociology, psychology, it's descriptive by nature. So what Harris is trying to do, he's trying to jump that divide using science, which is not
Mm,
actually adding up. As some people say, the maths is not mathing up.
yeah.
So that is a dilemma he finds himself in. It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard.
Yeah. Mm.
Mm.
And doesn't science in as an enterprise in itself need ethics from elsewhere? Because
Yeah.
I don't see anything in science that shouldn't that can tell Sam Harris not to fabricate his results in order to make his point, right?
Yeah.
So how does science tell you that you ought not to fabricate your results in order to maybe gain an academic standing or something of the sort? I think you have to get the moralities for doing science from somewhere else.
Somewhere else.
At the
As
end of the
someone
day,
said,
yeah,
science cannot even explain itself, which is actually true. It needs another
absolutely,
discipline. Yeah, it needs another
yeah,
discipline. I think just on that point, before we leave it, one of the things I've also been seeing, especially when you look at the history of the Western thought, especially the Westerners, you'll notice that through their history, they focused on one aspect of life at the expense of the other. There was a generation that focused on rationalism. There was a generation that focused on arts. There's a generation that focused on, like where we are, postmodernism. So they take one aspect of the truth and emphasize it to a certain extreme
mm,
without realizing that we all need all these aspects of truth, all these aspects of human life to make
yeah,
up what is really reality. So
yeah,
that is what people like Sam Harris are doing when talk about science. They're thinking science can explain everything at the exclusion of other disciplines, which is not
yeah,
actually true. Which is not
hmm,
actually true. So, for instance, sometime back in this country, the current president, I think when he was DP or a minister of agriculture, I forget, he said that we should do away with the arts and only deal with sciences. But that can't work. We need both sciences and arts. Yeah, we need. They complement one another.
just how many departments will you get rid of?
And and interestingly, art changes people more than actually science if you think of it. Think of song, think of drama, think of what?
Yeah.
Mm.
All right. So in summary, according to Harris's thesis, this is what we are saying. Maybe for someone who is joining in here, we are critiquing some Harris's moral landscape, how science can determine moral values, and what we are gathering from Sam Harris's book is that according to him, that which is good is what contributes to the well-being of conscious creatures. And how can science then determine what contributes to the well-being of creatures? He says, since that which is good affects the well-being of sentient beings or human beings, are actually facts that can be studied scientifically. So therefore, science can actually tell us what is right and wrong. But you also say that you also say that Harris is actually deterministic, right? He is a determinist. Sindio?
Yeah.
And you argue and you say actually that his position of determinism like sort of collapses into fatalism. So will you please explain that?
Harris says that free will is an illusion. Let's begin from there.
Mm,
But again, he goes ahead and says there is a difference between determinism and fatalism. Fatalism, he says, is what we see in religions like Islam. So he says for him, he does not believe in fatalism, but determinism. What is determinism? He believes determinism is that every event is actually caused by a prior action and condition. So that is what he believes, that there is a prior event and a prior action, that determines this event. But for fatalism, he believes that it is actually a fixed state of outcomes, regardless of one's actions. So that is what he says. That is how he differentiates the two. So he says, in determinism, one is still culpable of his actions. That's what he says. So he
mhm.
says your efforts and your intentions still in determinism make sense. So that's why you're still culpable of your actions. But he says
Yeah.
that is not so with fatalism. But now, as you read him, the interesting thing is, as you read Harris, he actually believes in fatalism. So you can't actually see the difference because he's just genuine on one point, and at one point he tries to split the hairs. So he says free will is an illusion. And rightly so, he says so. That's why he does not believe in retributive justice. He does not believe you sending someone to jail. Because, in fact, at one point he says, people end up in such circumstances not on their own. It's because of growing up with probably bad parents, they had bad genes. So, if you can actually criminalize those people, then go ahead and also criminalize earthquakes, tornadoes, because they have also killed people. That is his understanding. That is his understanding. But that is not coherent actually with reality as we know it. And you see, he's trying to bring in something, he's trying to break the foundations of the society. And you're trying to break the foundations of the society, then bring something that is quite coherent, something that is quite solid to replace that. So his determinism, though he says he does not believe in fatalism, but he's actually fatalistic in his position and in his worldview. And when you go to most of his YouTube debates, you'll notice he argues for that. He does not believe in free will at all. So
Yeah.
now, something on that, look at the self-contradiction he finds himself in.
Yeah.
He says that we are what we are because of bad genes, bad upgrowing, and all sorts of things. And so that is what he believes in. But at one point, he says that is not so for religious people. Actually, the religious people are taught how to be religious. That's what he says. But at another point, he says that when children are growing up, they're prone to religion more than to atheism. So children are prone to be religious than to be atheistic. That is what he says. Now, if that is the case, then his argument favors religion more than atheism. Then atheism is actually taught because it is not inherent in our nature.
Yeah.
But at
That's
one
true.
point he says, no. Actually, religion is taught. Religion is different. But on what basis again? And if he raises that, then what other things are taught and what other things are inherent? So he also needs to give us that dichotomy for us to understand. Now, tell me what is inherent in us, what is natural in us, and what is not natural. Because he tends to exclude religion from his conclusion, yet he's come up with a very good let me say, premise of a sort. But now it ends up in a very self-contradictory way. So those are the contradictions I see in his determinism. So he's trying to argue for free will, that people are also culpable for their actions, but at the same time, he's saying that actually free will is an illusion. Is an illusion. So it's quite confusing. It's quite confusing. It's quite confusing. I think that there is a lot of semantic confusion in that position.
Yeah, he seems to be playing around with words a lot.
Yeah,
Because then, given Sam Harris's view, then you cannot hold anyone responsible for
you
his
cannot.
actions,
So don't hold
right?
me
Because
responsible for following Jesus. I just found myself there. Then why
absolutely,
are you fighting me? I can't fight you for atheism. Don't fight me for my Christianity. But you see the condescending
absolutely,
language they have for religious people. Then why? Then inherently you believe actually they're smuggling in, they're actually stealing what you said. They're stealing the
yeah,
Christian ethic. Because,
absolutely.
yeah, they're stealing the Christian ethic to actually prove their point.
But again, I also think, given his view, it actually nullifies his criticism of religion. Because
Yeah.
on what basis then are you criticizing religion as maybe, for example,
Yes.
a cause of many wars and something like that? Those people, given Sam Harris's view, arrived there helplessly,
Yes.
right? They could not.
Mm.
I mean, there was
Mm.
nothing they could do. They just arrived there helplessly,
Yeah,
and that is what they did.
absolutely. There are
And you
matters of
know,
genes, mm,
yeah,
bad environment. Uh,
genes, bad environment, and all those
mm,
things. So you cannot hold anyone responsible. And I think
mm,
you mentioned a very good point, Aponyuma. You said that um, essentially his view collapses into fatalism, even though he denies that, even though he denies that. And remind me, there was a time I was having a debate with an atheist on the question of slavery in Africa. And she was a lady actually, and she said she was an evolutionist. So I asked her this question. I said, okay, let us assume, for the sake of argument, that evolution is true, because Sam Harris is an evolutionist as well. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that evolution is true. Now, one of the core concepts of evolution is actually the fittest, the survival
the
of the
fittest.
fittest,
Mm.
the fittest that does actually survive. So the question I asked her was, if that is the case, then what ground do you have to condemn the white man for enslaving the African man? Because what the white man is doing is just trying to survive,
Yes.
right? Just trying to survive, and the black man seemed to be the best way to actually
Yeah.
for this white man to survive. So Harris's view, and I think even the view of many atheists and their belief in evolution, really actually takes away their moral grounds for criticizing anything.
Mm.
Um,
They should be
absolutely,
consistent in their worldview. That is the point.
absolutely, yeah,
Receipt is unlivable. You can't live it. So they have to borrow from the Christian ethic to justify their
mhm,
position. So what
yeah.
Frank Turek has written is true. That what was the title of that book? Stealing from God.
Stealing from God, yeah.
Yeah.
Why atheists need God to make their case?
And I think that is why someone like Richard Dawkins says he's a cultural Christian, simply
Yeah,
because he has come to that conclusion and realized, by the way, my worldview is largely Christian. Even though
yeah.
I propagate atheism and naturalism, materialism, and all forms of evolution,
Mhm,
but I can't live that thing. Can't live that thing. Mm.
absolutely. So when addressing Harris's determinism, you conclude by saying that Harris's deterministic position is foundationally unrealistic and irrational, and will render the judicial system ineffective and ultimately lead to societal anarchy. If
Yeah.
and I think that's true, really. If you follow his thought and his argument to their logical conclusion, and that, I think, that is where you will end up at the end of the day. Um, and then we just
Just,
before we move
just
to, okay, Yeah, go
just a
ahead.
minute on that, is that as we said, it is their position is unlivable, because
Mm,
anything that is not based on truth is unlivable. Try it and think about communism. They tried it out in these other countries. It could not work out. It could not
yeah.
work out. So sometimes I've been trying to think, I think these atheists should just have their own society and try to live out that ethic and see if it is practical. It can't work. In fact, they don't
And see
raise their
what kind
children
of
that
society
way.
we can generate out of that.
Yeah. So there's we just have a society, a country for atheists, and let's see how they live it out. And interestingly, I wanted to know
Yeah.
how Samaris raises up his children. I just wanted to know, does he discipline his children? How does he approach the whole issue of discipline? I had many questions.
Because the things they do, they're just helpless, right?
Yeah, they're helpless. So if your
They
child
can't help.
steals, don't worry. He's just helpless to do that. Yeah.
Actually, Frank Turek in this book, he also talks about Sam Harris, by the way, and he says that Sam Harris is addressing the wrong question, because the question is not what determines what is moral, right? That is not the question. So the question is, why is something good or evil in the first place? It's not
Mm,
what determines. So
mm,
it actually seems to me that Sam Harris, in his quest to deny God as the foundation for morality, he ends up addressing the wrong question that we are not asking, because we are not asking what
yeah,
determines morality. We are asking, why make something moral? I mean,
that's the beauty.
why is something moral or
Yeah,
immoral to begin with? I think that is the question.
yeah, that's
Now you
that's
talk,
right.
yeah, you briefly talk about scientism, and I think your argument is that Sam Harris collapses into scientism. So will you just maybe say what scientism is and how Harris's position collapses into scientism?
Scientism is that belief that science can answer every question of life. That is what we mean by scientism. Sorry. And so he's trying to bring in the whole concept of science. So to try to explain now the whole issue of morality. And as I said earlier on, you'll notice that most scientists, even some neuroscientists, famous ones, even those who are not religious, I think the most famous one now is like Patricia Churchland. She does not even believe in what Sam Harris talks about, because she believes now, I think Sam Harris goes to a certain extreme. And
Yeah.
most of them, you'll notice, they actually don't hold that position that Sam Harris holds. Because it's such a unique one and such a new one. So he stretches now the whole concept of scientism to this extreme end of now morality, because he's trying to do something that few atheists have actually done. If you think of it, few atheists have explored the topic of science, answering the question of ethics and morality. So I believe that is a certain extreme. Why? Because those first presumptions that he has of the value, especially the issue of value, why this good, you see, the value issue. So he assumes that, and then now he brings in science to try to explain that. So there is a gap somewhere. I cannot connect between why this thing is good and what is
Yeah.
this thing here we call science, and how the two
Yeah.
marry together. So kawaida, he jumps into the whole concept of neuroscience and how the neurons, the genes, and everything affect our behavior. But I don't think he's trying to explain what we need to do. He's only trying to explain what is actually happening.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
so
Yeah.
he's in the realm of psychology, if you think of it, but not in the realm of really morality and ethics. Yes.
Absolutely. And I think that's true. One of the things you also mentioned here. Let me just get to read what you write here. Um, you say that Harris said his team. Of course, there are those who believe that science will eventually science will eventually, or advancement in technology will eventually see to it that the religion fizzles out. But you say no, that is a utopian dream uh, that has not been fulfilled yet. Will you make a comment about that?
When you look at most scientists, if you've ever read them, you'll notice, especially who are atheists,
Yeah.
Karl Marx was one of them, even Hitler, many people. Hitler was not a scientist, but rather he believed in
Evolution.
evolution, materialism, everything. You'll notice that they had this utopian idea that the growth, when science grows, technological advancement, religion will fizzle out. Now, has that happened? Is there any possibility of that happening? In fact, as one person said, that the idea that religion can be eradicated from human life is actually remains to be an article of faith by humanists, which is actually it's an article of faith. It can't go out.
Absolutely.
In fact, people are becoming more religious. America is the most developed nation in the world, yet it is one of the most religious nations in the world. Think of even China. People only talk about the government, thinking, oh, it is actually secular and all sorts of things. Do you know there are many religious people in China? In fact, it is actually said there are many Christians in China than in America. So the concept of religion can't go away. Look at Africa, look at Asia. In fact, Christianity is moving to Africa. It's moving to Asia. Despite the technological advancement, religion is not going away. And probably they should actually ask that question. And that's why some atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, they call it a bad gene that needs to be eradicated. So I think they have let me say at the bottom line, I agree with what that person said. It's an article of faith. It's an article of faith.
It's an article of faith. But also, but also, NATO, can science explain everything really?
It cannot. It cannot. And I know you are more predisposed towards that probably than me. Probably you can answer that question better. But I don't think science is good. I love science personally, some aspects of science, but it is a discipline that is limited, just like any other discipline. So the only thing is that trying to extol science to certain limits, and reasonable limits, actually, and realistic limits. So science is good. And then sometimes also they tend to equate scientists with atheism, which is actually wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's true. Science cannot even explain itself to begin with. Leave alone explaining everything. Science is not even the best way. There are those kinds of views that science is the best way to understanding and knowledge, or the best way to know, or science actually explains everything. Science cannot explain itself.
It cannot.
Sam Harris himself admits that they cannot even explain what life means. Right? So science is not even to explain what life is. They can only talk about the components of life. And I think there is this book that has been written by I think it is fine my shelf, but small book that is actually here. I can find it. This book was written by John Lennox, that can science explain everything. From this little book, and I think he makes a very good point. He actually says that is a confusion of, if you put God and science together, it's actually a confusion of mechanism. I mean, a confusion of categories, because God and science are different explanations. Science describes what is happening in the universe, right? But God is the reason as to why those things are there. And he gives an analogy here of saying it makes no sense. For example, it is Henry Ford who invented the engine of the car. So he says it makes no sense, for example, to say that I have studied the engine of the car. Now I understand how it works and everything. Therefore, I do not need Henry Ford. So I understand the internal mechanisms of the combustion. So therefore, Henry Ford does not exist. But he says, no, Henry Ford and the internal combustion mechanisms, those are two different explanations, right? The laws of internal combustion describe how the engine runs. But Henry Ford explains why the engine is there in the first place. So those are two different explanations. What is interesting, I don't know in your own experience, but in my own experience, majority of the people who actually collapse into scientism are not even scientists, really.
Yeah, that's true.
So maybe I find that to be very interesting.
It is. It's very true. So there's something you said earlier on. You said that they cannot even describe what life is, and I know there is
Yeah,
a mystery to what life is. But as Christians, we come here and actually tell you that God is life, and the way, the truth, and the life.
yeah.
But now we are on that journey of knowing that life. So we have already arrived at it, yet still in the process of arriving there. But now these guys, there are many things that are still hazy. So their concept of truth is still unfounded. It is still hazy. It is still unexplainable. So
Mhm.
it's like just groping around in the dark.
Yeah,
That's the point. And then secondly, I read somewhere, and I had ever wondered where that quote came from. And I only realized it came from Thomas Aquinas, where he said that theology is the queen of all sciences.
yeah, yeah,
And that's very true. So when you think of it, that the Western nations, especially where we had the scientific explosion, it only came from a Christian basis.
yeah.
And how Christianity, true Christianity, is that Christianity believes that all disciplines find their coherence in who God is. So God is a
Absolutely.
unifying factor. He's a source of all these disciplines per se. So then theology becomes actually the highest level of theoretical engagement,
Yes.
as we see, and that is what Thomas Aquinas says. It becomes the
Mm.
highest level. So no wonder he called it the queen of all sciences. So
Yes.
Christians are not against science, but they believe that it has its own place in human affairs and in a pursuit for truth.
Yeah. I actually wrote a paper on that. There is a sense in which Christianity is actually the motor that did drive modern science, and
Oh,
just that is just a fact that even philosophers of science um, do agree on that matter as well.
yeah.
So I think, and I think you make very good points there. That Christianity is not antithetical to science; it is not anti-scientific. And you mentioned here in your paper. Let me just read it. You mentioned here, and you say that Harris wrongly asserts that believers mistrust science. Believers do not mistrust science, but they do mistrust some scientists. Right?
Yes.
You're going to say that scientists aren't infallible, right? Scientists have different philosophical beliefs, disagreements about reality that cannot be settled on scientific grounds alone, which affect how they think about science and its theories. So the Bible
Mm.
points that we have two kinds of knowledge: natural revelation and biblical revelation, or what we'll call special
Mm.
revelation. So one is acquired empirically and the other by revelation. So science and the Bible do not conflict, but correlate to reveal the ultimate truth. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I have a brief comment on that. That is what we usually see, that religion and science, you see those false dichotomies that we have,
Yeah.
and they tend to propagate that. But you realize when you go to the ground, you realize no, Christians, or rather, Christianity is not against science. It's only that some scientists are against Christianity. It's not like science
Mm,
is against Christianity. Some scientists who are against Christianity. So they're trying to
mm,
do what Harris is doing, trying to use science to justify their philosophical assumptions. So
yeah.
uh, that is what we actually see in reality. So
Yeah.
they're not anti what?
Anti-scientific.
Anti.
Well,
Not
or
against
anti.
each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they complement one another.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think, as you also mentioned in your paper about how Harris confuses, I think, epistemology and ontology. Epistemology, knowing that objective morality exists, and ontology, why objective morality exists. So I think for him, he's more focused on the issue of epistemology, and
Yes.
not even answering the question of
Ontology.
ontology, right?
Yeah.
But before we bring this to a close, I just want to hear what you'll say about this, because I also noticed when I read Harris, he noticed a potential objection to his view, but he glossed over it and he didn't even address it. And let me let me hear what your thoughts are on it. He actually he not this is the objection that I noticed that he really just glosses over. The objection is this: what if one's well-being is hostile to another's? Right?
Mhm.
What if one's well-being is dependent on killing young boys and having sex with their corpses? Right? So, okay. What if my well-being is dependent on killing someone else?
Yeah.
Do you think Harris has an answer to that? Why should we consider your well-being over my own well-being? Because if my own well-being depends on killing you, why should I not kill you for my own well-being?
And if you read, I think he starts introspecting himself at a certain point when you read that book, and
Yeah.
he realizes that kind of subjectivity, where actually my well-being can be eating children, small children.
Yeah.
I find pleasure in that. You see,
Yeah.
so he says, and then he tries to argue and say, but no, in this landscape of morality, so it's a continuum. So you'll find some peaks and some lows, but now he glosses over, you actually use the right word. He glosses over that thing. He does not handle it exhaustively. So he says it will have the lows and the peaks, and and he says those are the things we still need to handle, or rather iron out, as we
Mm.
move on, because we are still growing in our knowledge. That is what he says. But you see, that is a very critical thing that we have actually skipped. Because if you just write a book and say actually science can explain, and you have said science can actually explain, and he actually use neuroscience to say that, and then you leave people hanging on some of those foundational issues, that's very dangerous. That's very dangerous.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I don't see him handling that issue quite well. And in fact, if you're talking about morality, then please, especially now from an atheistic point of view, please go and also examine other people, rather philosophers, who have handled that topic
Yeah.
in history.
Mm.
And a good example is Manuel Kant, who has written a book about it called The Categorical Imperative, who was actually against well-being, the concept of well-being.
Mm.
And at least, though we don't agree with him fully, but at least what Immanuel Kant did is he gave us a standard. He gave us a standard on on what to do. And it was
Yeah.
quite universal, probably better even than the one that Sam Harris has, that can even try to answer, because it was actually utilitarian by nature. It can try to answer some of these questions that now we are raising about subjective issues. But
Yeah.
Sam Harris' position is quite lame in handling those issues. It's quite lame. You can't
Yeah.
depend on it. So he does not
Yeah.
handle that issue. Neither is he endeavoring to answer that issue. He will only tell you if you corner him, and I know some people have cornered him. He'll only say, but we're also progressing. We're also progressing. We're also learning. We're also knowing. Something that is objective, something that is universal.
Yeah.
We must have something that is standard, actually. We
Yeah.
need to have something that is unchanging.
Absolutely.
And I think
Abs-
Ravi uses a good example. He says, what about if you are on a traffic and then you notice you're on traffic and there is a red light there, you don't need to move. And then you realize, actually, your car is moving and all other people are standing, or rather that post is moving and you are actually standing. It will be very confusing. You need something that is actually
Static.
immovable and
Yeah.
static
Yeah.
for you to measure other things.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And a way in which Harris tries to get out of that objection is he begins talking about that we should maximize the collective well-being. And this is what he says. He says that a universe in which all conscious beings suffer the worst possible misery is worse than in which they experience well-being, right? But that is also a problem. I think there is a
Mm.
critique of his, a guy called Russell Rutherford, who is an editor in chief of the Journal of Evolution and technology. So he actually reviewed Sam Harris's moral landscape, and this is what this is what he notes. He says a very important point here about the issue of collective well-being. Because don't you see? Okay, I will ask you to make a comment on that. But this is what he says. He says that Harris seems to think that the conduct that maximizes global well-being is morally right, because what is morally right is something like maximizing global well-being. Do you see a problem with that? That Harris seems to think that the conduct that maximizes global well-being is morally right, and what is morally right is maximizing global well-being. Do you notice a problem with that?
Is it equivocation?
Circular reasoning.
A circular reasoning.
Absolutely.
Who? Why is Quran right? It's because God says it is right. And why do you say God is right? It's because Quran says it is
Because the
actually.
Quran says so.
Yeah, yeah,
It's the
yeah.
kind of argument that Harris is making here, because he's already assuming that collective well-being is a good thing, right? So
Mm.
maximizing collective well-being is a moral thing. And then he goes on to say, uh, then a good thing is like maximizing collective collective,
Probably.
collective well-being. So some kind of circular reasoning.
Circular reasoning. Yeah, that's true. And and
Yes,
in
go
fact,
on.
in fact, that guy has answered it well. But just something,
Yeah.
a detail, in fact, in that thing you said, collective well-being, that it means it's a collective thing, probably for a
Mm,
society or a group of people. But now how you need to work around it, because this is a collective issue. But you see, there are
mm,
individuals in that group.
yeah.
You see, so it's a balance of group versus individual. So how do you separate group morality from individual morality, and how do you
Individual.
like marry them together and come up with something that is quite objective? So when you pursue Harris quite well, is that he does not talk, if you are so keen, you'll notice, he does not talk about individual morality a lot. He only talks about collective morality. And that can be so
Collective.
general,
Yeah.
because there are many assumptions there. And then so at the end of the day, something that Sam Harris' position will not deal with are moral dilemmas.
Yeah.
He can't deal with moral dilemmas. And I find, I'm a Christian, I find Christianity deals with that quite well.
Actually, I tend to think that the question of morality doesn't even make sense given Harris's view, because he talks about how morality depends on the states of the brain as well, and science can be able to study the states of the brain. Therefore, that is how science can be able to determine what is good uh, for sentient creatures. But also, I think one of the things you mentioned in your paper, I think you're quoting someone, I don't remember exactly, but you were saying in your paper that the guys who are doing neuroscience are speaking in the second person. You were studying someone's experience, but someone's experience is very different from the person who is actually studying that person. And I think you go on to say that the things that you can get out of that in terms of morality is actually inconclusive. You can't conclusively come up with anything that will actually be the foundation for morality.
Yeah. So his position on that is that that position cannot explain some human aspects, like of consciousness, where you
Yeah.
experience it from the first person, because it's in neuroscience, as we say, science is limited. So you see, you can only explain that from a third person point
Yeah.
of view. So you are
Yeah.
studying someone from the outside. So it has its own
Yeah.
limitations. So there are certain things that you can't explain that the
Mm.
person is experiencing by himself, something experiential, something empirical. So it's limited on that regard. So,
Yeah.
but those are the things that Sam Harris does not think clearly about. I think Harris is just determined to disprove Christianity and anything religious. So he is only trying to smuggle in science to try to explain that, despite of the inconsistencies he
Yeah.
comes up with.
Two more things, and then we close this up. One also of the criticism that I have with the whole issue of human flourishing or the collective well-being of certain creatures is that you cannot build an ethical framework based on human flourishing alone, because what is good or not good for a human being is actually tied to his telos or his design. I don't know what your comment is that. So my argument is that you cannot even talk about morality without understanding who a human being is or what is the purpose of a human being.
Mm.
Do you have any comment on that?
That is very foundational, and that is a question that is usually asked in philosophy, apologetics, and all sorts of things. That when you're talking about any worldview, it must answer four questions. They 4 or 5. The question of beginning, Genesis, the question of meaning, the meaning of purpose, morality, and what, and our destiny.
Yeah.
So, on the issue of meaning, the issue of purpose, it is lame. If you're only talking about science, the issue of meaning, the issue of purpose, it is incapable of actually solving that. So, and as I said earlier on, there are several things he assumes. Who is a human being? Why were we created, or why did we evolve, or according to what he believes? Why that? And why is it that morality only applies to human beings and not to cows?
Yeah, that's true.
Those basic questions: why good, why evil, where do they come from, why that dichotomy? You see, there are those foundational questions that I don't know his answer really. So as you say, on the issue of meaning and why human being, and why we are like the epitome, or rather the highest creatures in terms of being and dignity, he's actually lame and incapable of explaining that.
Yeah. So you cannot explain morality without understanding human purpose or the
Human
telos
purpose,
or the design.
yeah, the
You
design, yes.
actually, you actually, yeah, the design. You actually talked about Kant. I think it is Kant who actually he tried to build his entire framework without invoking God, but he ended up saying that he ended up concluding that um, every effort to try and build an ethical framework without invoking God, and I mean without without telos or without design, is actually wrong-headed at the end of the day. He noticed
Mm,
until you understand what a human being is and the end of that human being, you cannot talk about morality
mm. That was
in a
right,
way
yeah.
that makes sense. In a way that makes sense. And then
Yes.
finally, I also noticed that Harry seems to try, and you mentioned this somewhere in either the beginning or in the middle. You mentioned that Harry seems to deny that religion is a product of evolution. He seems to actually deny that. And the reason as to why he denies that, I think it's because it undermines his thesis.
Yes.
Because if religion then is a product of evolution, he actually says that human beings arrive at their beliefs helplessly. There's nothing, they
Yes.
just arrive at their beliefs, okay?
Mm.
So don't you think that though he fails to, the reason as to why he doesn't want to admit that is because it undermines his thesis entirely.
Absolutely, because he's writing a book to discredit Christianity and Christian ethic and morality. So if he goes ahead and actually says that these guys are doing what they're doing because of heredity, because of genes and what, it undermines is actually the whole treatise. So he has to invent a way of circumnavigating around it. And so he says actually religious people are taught to be religious. That is what he says. So those are the inherent self-contradictions you see in his treatise. So you see it is someone who is already determined to disbelieve the supernatural, to disbelieve the religious. So he uses any arsenal on his hand. He employs any arsenal and every arsenal on his hand to discredit Christianity. So that is what we see. So, but you end up in circular reasoning, as you have said, and then secondly, in contradictions.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. He goes on to contradict himself over and over again. So finally, my question to you is if Sam Harris's view is insufficient to explain morality, and I've seen, I think it fails to explain why something is good to begin, because I think that is a question. Okay. So if his system fails, what do you think is the only adequate foundation for objective morality?
So he has this atheist, Sam Harris, has tried to use science to explain morality, and it has failed. And I think that is the last linchpin of the atheist against theism.
Yeah.
So then the only option should be theism, not atheism. But
Yeah.
even as we narrow down to theism, because there are quite a wide variety of religions there. So which religion among the theists makes sense? And probably that is a topic and a subject on another day. But I still see Christianity making a lot of sense in explaining the whole concept of morality. Explaining the whole concept of morality that is unchanging and that is reasonable and realistic at the end of the day. And when you compare that with other major religions, and probably I think you've done some of those debates or interviews somewhere. When you compare that with Islam, probably Hinduism, Buddhism, and all the other major religions, they're quite different. Christianity stands out really. So
Absolutely.
I'll still go for the Christian ethic. And we've seen the fruit of it. Look at the Western countries. Why is it that Muslims are running away from their countries to Europe, to America? It's because of that Christian ethic that has shaped their society over a period of time. There is freedom. Human rights are espoused, though now we are on a certain extreme, but ideally, it has been Europe and America have been like nations to emulate, especially in terms of democracy, human rights, and freedom, really, speakingly. So just look at Islamic countries and what is happening there. Just look at countries that espouse communism and look what has happened there. So we can actually see the fruit of Christianity and compare and say, by the way, Christianity makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Let me just read your conclusion here and then give you the final word. Thank you for those good thoughts. This is what you conclude in your paper. You say that Harris's philosophical treatise of the moral landscape lacks adequate explanatory power. The scientific objectives standard for morality he espouses lacks the coherent explanatory power. He ends up with false dichotomies. It is either science versus religion, either moral landscape or religion stroke philosophy. And post hoc is odd fallacy to justify his position. He assumes the value of collective well-being and forces his readers to buy into it. This is clearly seen in such statements. The deeper point is that there simply must be answers to questions of this kind. And I am convinced that every appearance of terms like metaethics, deontology, non-cognitivism, and realism, etc., directly increases the amount of boredom in the universe. The self-contradiction is inevitable and appalling. His conflict discredits philosophy to extol science, but ends up treating us with a poorly substantiated philosophical topic. It is either Harris's moral landscape or nothing else. Though Harris brings on a relatively new paradigm in moral philosophy, he does not simply consider the real ethical issues discussed in history. Surprisingly, Jeremy Bentham handled the same topic in the 18th century in a book called The Principles of Moral and Legislation. Yet Harris only mentions him in passing in a footnote. It renders his treatise quite unfalsifiable. An objective treatise must consider and examine competing positions. And finally, this is what you say, that the major underpinning of Harris's work is the value problem. He does not give a value to measure the well-being of conscious creatures. It is reserved for atoms and neurons. He barely examines Immanuel Kant's utilitarian moral philosophy that is a hallmark of moral debates in history. Kant opposed the idea that moral law can be defined in terms of well-being. He posited that it must be established through a universal practical reason. That is, in order for an act to be moral, it must be done for its own sake and not because of well-being. At least Kant gave a standard to measure the value of moral acts. Harris leaves us at the mercy of atoms and neurons. Without an objective, transcendent moral standard, the value problem and self-contradiction persist. At best, we end up with moral relativism that Harris rejects as untenable and irrational. Final thoughts from you.
I think you have given my final thoughts. But that conclusion sums up everything. That in his pursuit for science, he ends up treating us with philosophy. In his pursuit for objective morality, he ends up treating us with relativism at the end of the day. So those contradictions is what I see. And then there's something else about these new atheists. They're quite, they have a condescending attitude towards people of contrary opinion.
They even mockery and stuff like that.
Yeah, mockery. And Sam Harris passes as someone who is quite reasonable. I thought so. You see, Hitchens is quite abrasive. Hitchens and Dawkins, they're quite abrasive in their language in their debate. Sam Harris looks collected, simple, but he is subtly dangerous in that regard, in terms of he can really undercut you without you knowing. So there is that condescending attitude that they have that is unwarranted, I believe so. So that in itself tells you probably their motive, that it is not probably a pursuit for truth, but they're trying to undermine and discredit something at the heart of heart. So that is what Ravi once said, that there are some people who are good at destroying and not building. So he says that if you see there is a boundary, please ask why that boundary is there. Do not just go and move boundaries. Ask why they were there in the first place. You can't just go and move boundaries and destroy boundaries. There is a reason why those boundaries are there, even as they come to an end. I remember when you were growing up, according to our culture, this is what happens. For instance, my father cannot greet my wife. You see, as in shaking hands. I used to see that as very archaic. How do you do that when we are on 21st century? And it has its own limitations. But I realized why that happens. It's because traditionally, fathers sometimes will sleep with their daughters-in-law. So there were boundaries that were placed there for that kind of thing. So that is how they knew how to control moral issues, rather to work on moral issues. So there was a reason for that. So I can't just come from nowhere and disband that and discredit that without knowing why that was put there in the first place. So that is what, when you look at these guys, that is what they are doing. They're not genuine and sincere enough to actually know why these things are there and why these things are done the way they're done. They're just there to discredit them, and in any way they want to do it. And so sometimes, we end up in something that is unreasonable, something that is unrealistic, and something that is unbelievable. I welcome everyone to consider the Christian truth and read the Bible. First, start by reading the Bible.
Yes, and I think you make very good final thoughts there. That I think atheists are very good at destroying what is already there without establishing any viable alternative for that. No wonder Dawkins goes on to describe himself as a cultural Christian, because he has nothing to offer. Right? As we have seen here, a good example is Sam Harris, who claims that science can determine morality, yet he's full of all sorts of contradictions, and he doesn't even by the end up proving his thesis.
He does not.
He does not anywhere near. So thank you so much for coming on our stream today. The Lord bless you.
Thank you.
And as Jesus said, John 8, thou shalt know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So I hope those who are watching will seek and find Jesus, and Jesus will set them free. So thank you, and God bless.
Thank you. God bless you too.